On the first graph on your note paper, you're going to circle -2, and you're going to leave it open, and you're going to shade it to the right. So this is just because I didn't graph it when I copied the papers. So what we're going to do is we're going to write this. We're going to start with set notation first. So that's when we can write it with an inequality, less than, greater than. So on this one, we're writing x. You write the number that is circled, so that's -2. And then from there, these numbers are bigger than -2, so we're going to do greater than symbol. And we don't want to equal -2. So on here, we're just going to leave x is greater than -2. So in words, that's x is greater than -2. Interval notation, remember intervals is you just come across from the left. What is the smallest number and what is the biggest number? So in this case, we have -2. And because there's an arrow, that means it's going to keep going. So we're going to have -2, infinity. And in this case, they're both going to be parentheses because you can't equal infinity and the -2 is open. So the next one, I want you to draw an open circle on 0 and draw a closed circle on the 5 and shade it in. And then we're going to shade everything in between there. So for this one, we're going to start with interval notation. So the first number you come to, the smallest number is 0, and the biggest number is 5. So we're going to have 0, 5. And we do want to include the 5, so the 5 is going to have a bracket, and 0 is open, so it has parentheses. And from class the time before, we put the x in for set notation. When our number is in between 0 to 5, we're going to put x in between the 0 and the 5. The less than symbols stay the same, because if I have x is less than 5 here, and then if you just look at this side, the alligator is eating the x. That means x is greater than the 0. And if you were to flip it around, like we're used to doing and putting x first, x is greater than the 0. So in this case, we have the two numbers on the side. So 0, the x, and the 5. We keep the less than signs always when you have your bigger number on the right and smaller on the left. And then we do want it to equal the 5. So the bracket and the equal to should be the same. If it has a bracket, then it must have an equal to. So we're going to say that x is smaller or less than or equal to the 5, but bigger or greater than 0. The next one is written in words already. So we're going to start there. X is less than 3. So we're going to write x, the less than sign, and 3. So we're going to circle the 3. And it's not equal to 3, so leave it open. And this, remember, that shows us that less than. You can make an arrow out of it, and it shows us we're going to shade everything less, smaller numbers. So now we're going to do interval notation. As you come across, the first thing we see is an arrow, and the biggest thing we come to is the number 3. So because we have an arrow headed towards the left, those are negative numbers. So we're going to say negative infinity to the number 3. 3 is open, so parentheses, not bracket. The next one, let's just start here. This says x is less or equal to negative 4. So if we're going to graph that, we're going to go to negative 4. It could equal, and we want everything less. So it would look something like that. And if we're going to do intervals, so we come across, the first thing we have is an arrow, and the biggest number we have is negative 4. So again, we're going to do negative infinity to 4. This time the 4 is included. It is equal. It has the equal to line. So we are going to put a bracket around it. This last one, let's start by putting the x in between. So x is in between negative 5 and 2. And then we're going to keep the less than symbols. And because there's brackets on both the negative 5 and the 2, we're going to put equal to on both. So we come to our graph, we're going to circle the negative 5, and we're going to circle the 2. And then we want to include everything in between negative 5 and 2. So the number 1.5 is included. The number 1.9999 is included. The number negative 4.7 is included. Anything in between negative 5 and 2. So we're going to say x is less than or equal to 2, but greater or equal to negative 5. Okay, for the next one, I want you to draw a line. Start up at the top left corner, and come down to the bottom right corner. And it was supposed to go through the center, but it doesn't matter so much. Okay, so we're going to do interval notation, domain and range first. So domain, you come across from the left, and we want the biggest number on the right. So as you come across on the left, the first thing we see is an arrow. That means it doesn't actually stop at negative 5. And the last thing we see is an arrow, so it doesn't stop at 5. So we're going to have negative infinity to positive infinity. The range, we come up from the bottom. And again, the first thing we come to is that arrow. And on the top, same thing. So range negative infinity to infinity. And when we're writing set notation, we put the x in between. We put our less than signs. And since you can never equal infinity, we don't put any equal to signs. Since range is y numbers and domain is x, this time we're going to put a y in between. And we use the less than signs. And we're not going to equal infinity. So if we want the maximum and the maximum is the highest point on your graph. Since there's not an actual high point, it keeps going forever. In this case, the maximum is not defined. And that would be, if I wanted you to tell me the maximum, that's the answer you would tell me. Minimum is the lowest point on your graph. And in this case, it keeps going. So again, we're going to say that the minimum is not defined. Increasing, decreasing. Since this graph, as you come across from the left and go across to the right, you put your little guy up there on the left side of the line, he's going to fall down. So this graph is decreasing. And we could say it's decreasing from negative infinity to infinity. And the numbers you look at to say the interval is you're looking at the x-axis numbers when you're saying the interval for decreasing and increasing. Okay, the next one, I want you to draw an open circle at negative 4, negative 2, and an open circle at 3, 3. So open negative 4 down 2, open, and open at 3, 3. And then we're just going to draw a line to connect those two. So domain and range. Again, we're going to come across from the left, and we're going to go to the biggest number on the right. So in this case, we've got a -4 and a 3. So -4, 3. And they're both open circles, so I'm going to put parentheses around both. Range, you come from the bottom. The first number we come to is -4. Excuse me. -2, down 1, down 2, -2, comma, the top number is a 3. And those are both open, so keep them open. We're going to put X in between the two numbers. We're going to put less than signs always. And because they're both open, we are not going to put the equal to line. Range, we put the two numbers. We put less than on both. And they're both open, so no equal line. Maximum and minimum, this one's a little tricky. You may think that this point right here is the maximum. However, since it's not an actual point, at 3, 3, the line gets closer and closer to that point, but it's never actually going to hit 3, 3. So for the maximum, this is actually also not defined. So if there's an arrow or there's an open circle at the highest point on the graph, it's not going to be defined. The minimum is the lowest point, so it sure looks like it's this point again, but remember that point is not an actual point. It's not an actual solution. It's open. That means it's not included. So we're going to say not defined on that one also. And then for increasing, decreasing, this graph, you put your little guy over here, and he's going to climb up that line. So this one is increasing. And if we want to say where it's increasing from, well, the whole graph is increasing. So we're going to use the domain numbers. The domain numbers is -4 to 3. So we're going to write -4 to 3. That's where the graph is increasing. On this one, I want you to draw a circle on the -3 on the axis. I want you to draw a curve up to the 2, and then you're just going to curve it back down and draw an arrow that will keep going. So for domain and range, again, we're going to come across. Domain is left to right, so we want the left number and the biggest right side of the graph. So we start at -3. It is closed. And the biggest thing we see is an arrow, and that's going to keep going. So infinity. Range, we come from the bottom. So notice on the bottom, again, we see that arrow. And on the very top, we have the number 2. So it's going to be -infinity to the number 2. We include the 2. Infinity we can never equal, so parentheses. Put your X in between the -3 and the infinity. Less than's on both. Because there's a bracket, that means it's an equal to. And here, put your Y in between the two numbers, put your less than signs. And because it has a bracket, we also want to equal the 2. Maximum, we look for the highest point on the graph. And in this case, the highest point is this one here. So I need to name that point. If I were to name that point, I've got 1, 2. I want to name, what is that point? X, Y. So I don't go left or right at all. So that's 0, comma. I go up to 0, 2. 0, 2, X, Y. That's how we name the maximum and minimum. The minimum, it kind of looks like it's the point -3, 0. Except there's an arrow here, which means that it keeps going and goes to infinity, therefore it is not